I'd like to introduce our next speaker. This is Katrina Strathmann. She's a restoration ecologist and riparian program director for the Mid-Columbia Fisheries Enhancement Group. Katrina has 27 years of experience, having previously worked for the Yakama Nation and the National Park Service. Ms. Strathmann's belief is that we can increase project success by applying science to our designs and conscientiously evaluating our implementation outcomes. Her current focus includes using knowledge of intertwined fluvial and biological processes that create and sustain riparian forests to implement novel riparian restoration methods. Katrina has an MS in Ecology and Systematic Biology from San Francisco State University. Go ahead, Katrina.
We're going to look under the hood of how at least our group does riparian restoration in the East Cascades, which I think is probably somewhat analogous to Hart sites on the west side of the state. So before I jump in, I just wanted to thank the many funders that we have that supported the projects that I'll be talking about, from Department of Ecology's Water Quality Program, the Salmon Recovery Funding Board, the Washington Conservation Commission, in a number of programs there, the Fish and Wildlife Services Partners for Wildlife Program, and the many partners and landowners and Mid-Columbia Fisheries staff who really made these projects happen. So part of a really broad team. So before I move off of this first slide, I wanted to tell you, I also wanted to thank Kittitas County for letting me borrow the image, but I love this image because it is the Yakama River outside of Ellensburg, which is a managed river, managed flows for irrigation. But you can still see in the center of the screen, the meander bend that has a mixed age stand mosaic of recruiting riparian forest. And in the foreground are some planted riparian forest on the left bank, which is pretty exciting. And in the upper right, kind of peeking out behind some of the trees, is another riparian restoration site. So it kind of embodies a lot of the type of work that we do, and some of our relic riparian forest. So as I said, we work on the east side, and I'm going to be talking a lot about deciduous riparian forests, specifically cottonwood-dominated forests and associated shrubs that are dominated primarily by willow species and some alder species, not typically red alder in our work area of the Mid-Columbia Fisheries Enhancement Group. So we're one of 14 groups in the state, and we work in 4 counties shown here. So there are going to be a lot of differences for you, but because of ecological differences, but I hope that you have some takeaways. So with that, I'm going to jump right into our approach, which is that we start with defining what we want to see at a particular project. What are the missing functions that we're trying to restore, whether it's roughness or keeping cool water cool by increasing missing canopy, slowing some rapid bank erosion with rooting density, or like what's illustrated in the Big Wood River in Idaho in this image, creating a long-term source of large wood that falls into the river, helps scour pools develop, it grades sediment. It really contributes to the channel complexity that is really important in our aquatic habitats. And working for a fisheries enhancement group, that's one of the missions of our organization. We also think about what role does wildlife habitat play in terms of driving the purpose of our project, whether it's for migratory songbirds, insect diversity, or simply providing a climate refugia during migration for species, which is becoming more and more important. We also look at a wide range of site conditions in assessing how we're going to approach a project. And I'm just going to look at the key things that are pretty common and really drive the selection of the planting method, since that's what I'm talking about today. So trying to really narrow the scope. A lot of those things relate to water, whether it's precip zone, how deep is groundwater, like illustrated in the image on the right at one of our restoration sites, and kind of a typical depth to groundwater. How well drained are our soils, or how well do they retain moisture? And then we look at flooding, frequency, duration, velocity. We also want to consider what is the current state of vegetation. And for planning purposes, it can tell us a lot about the current vegetation, can tell us a lot about site history and what we think some of the impacts are probably will have been. But looking at weed pressure and native propagule availability is very important for our planning. We also look at herbivory impacts and what we may need to do to get ahead of the game in terms of those. And then we have a number of logistical issues that we consider. What's that access going to be after construction, or what is it currently for any kind of mechanized planting that we might want it to be doing. And then finally, what water sources are available for potential irrigation on a site. And this is where the analogous conditions for your harsh sites may have a limitation. I don't know what some of those conditions are, but so take them with a grain of salt, and I'm interested in your questions at the end. I love this table that I created a few years ago, adapted from a couple of papers that really look at different revegetation methods, those that are lower cost and smaller scale to really high cost, high challenges to implement, but have very large scale effects on regeneration of our riparian restoration. So it really helps us to get out of the mindset that riparian restoration is simply about sticking plant material in the ground. However, that is what I'm going to be talking about today, and focusing really in on two of the dominant plant material, planting methods that we use, and not talking at all about assisted regeneration methods that we've been testing, or even how we can kind of get ahead of the game by getting involved in engineering and construction design of aquatic or floodplain restoration projects to try to support riparian restoration, either natural regeneration processes or to support improved planting outcomes. So this is what we'll look at today. Just about all of our projects within this South Central Washington area have a roughly 5-year timeline. If we're fortunate and it's a part of a construction design, we're doing that before we even get started on the planting. But then in year one, we start with site preparation activities, ordering plant material, getting our plans together. And it's not until year two that we're planting, with 2 to 3 years dedicated to maintenance, which is largely any herbivory deterrent activities that we have, irrigation, which you'll see, and also very important weed control. I think we could probably have a whole workshop on riparian weed control. So I'm going to start by talking about one of the main drivers of how we approach projects, which is groundwater. And I tried to break it down into how depth to groundwater in our area really drives our methods, our potential planting methods, in terms of the two that we're talking about today, and also the assemblage types. So, for example, in really shallow groundwater, where we've got groundwater accessible, and groundwater meaning water that's soil moisture that's available at low flow elevations, so low flow times of the year. We can conventionally plant all species assemblages that we might be using in a particular that are appropriate for a particular site in these shallow conditions. But once we get into moderate or deeper groundwater, then for conventional planting, irrigation is required, or we need to move to an alternative method, which we call deep planting, and you may use something similar over on the west side. Now, if we're in very deep groundwater conditions, then using riparian mesic species that we'll look at as well is not possible. One of our dominant species, the black cottonwood, it's documented widely in the literature that they don't thrive when groundwater is deeper than about 6 feet. So that's really one of our thresholds for planting. And then we move to conventional planting with irrigation, and that also changes the types of plant assemblages that we'll focus on. We also look at how long inundation conditions last on a site. If it's a long duration inundation of greater than 4 to 6 weeks, then we have a select number of hydric species that we can use that can tolerate that level of inundation. But if it's low to moderate inundation, so something that's still in a flood environment, but it's not flooded for long periods of time, including cottonwood, then we can use a broader suite of hydric species, as well as some other riparian forest and riparian transitional species. And of course, if for species that are in situations where there's no inundation, because dry forest assemblages are not tolerant of any inundation outside of probably a day or two, we limit our species selections in when there's a lot of inundation. So we also look at flood velocities, and this is an example of a plant protection structure that we installed in the lower Yakama River, and we're high. So this is on a meander bend, lower elevations, high flow flood velocities in the winter, and we want to protect plants behind that structure from shear by debris that's moving across the site. So we're also thinking about how we can keep plants from damage before their roots are established and they're able to resprout. And we use a similar way of thinking about that short-term temporary damage prevention while the plants are vulnerable to how we think about herbivory. So when we've got elk, deer, or beaver, we also do temporary fencing to either get plants established up above browse lines or to get them established until they can resprout from, if those are their resprouting species, from established roots. So this is an example of an 8-foot elk fence at a site that's just outside of Cle Elum. And we also, as I said, use beaver exclusion fencing in areas that are up above the 2-year flood zone. So this is a field fence with a skirt around the base so that the critters can't crawl, under our fencing. And of course, our livestock fencing is permanent, so I'm not showing you that. We also do a lot of work up front, both managing weeds and thinking about carefully how to manage weeds. It's an enormous effort with a lot of cost associated with it. And one of the most substantial pressures on our plantings outside of water. The initial weed condition really influences both the site preparation that's needed, as well as the post-planting maintenance. However, even if we're starting with bare soil from a construction project that doesn't require any initial site preparation, we still know that we're going to have a lot of post-planting maintenance and plan for that. The only type of weed management issue that affects our selection of planting method is we have begun to use deep planting in the situations when we have reed canary grass. And I'll show you a site where we've done that, doing some site prep on the reed canary grass and then using this deep planting technique, not to plant it deep in the soil because of soil moisture, but below the sod layer of the reed canary roots. I could spend a lot of time on this, on weed management, but I'm going to move on to planting techniques, and we can recircle back to that in questions if you'd like. I mentioned, I referred to these plant assemblages that we use, and if you really love getting into the weeds like I do about species selection or what other people are doing, I wanted you to see what those dominant assemblages are and also what species we use in conventional planting versus deep planting. Now, a couple of caveats here. One is I'm talking about a very, very large work area that our group has. So these are dominant species within roughly the 6 to 20 inch precip zone, mostly representing what we do in the Yakama Basin, but to in a lesser extent in the Middle Columbia. They're species that are selected largely because of their higher survival rates and being good colonizers that are dominant in relic native plant communities. So we definitely select species based on their ability to provide the functions that we're looking for. So I'm going to jump now into deep planting, which is a method that we use where soil moisture is usually between 2 or 3 and 6 foot depth. We place tall plant material, which is rooted with those root masses into moist soil, so into the capillary fringe zone, using mechanical methods like this skidster mounted auger. We've also used excavator mounted augers at the right. We also use a hydraulic ram through contractor. There are a couple contractors that use this technique. So this is a 6-foot steel shank that is pushed in the ground, and then this tall plant material is dropped into the hole. This is another site that shows the steel shank pushed all the way into the ground. Regardless if we're using augering or the hydraulic ram, we need to backfill. And this is a contractor who is using a modified ripper tine to push soil back into the hole. You can also just do this with shovels and a crew. But getting that moist soil contact along the stem is very important. So when I'm talking about tall plants, what I mean are these 5 to 10 foot tall stems on top of elongated root masses. And we've used root masses that have been produced that are up to 18 inches long. So they can be quite large. Then they give us even more bandwidth to play with when we're trying to put them deep in the soil. We leave a minimum of a foot of the stem, preferentially greater than 5 live buds or leaf nodes above ground with a fall installation. And it's very important to focus on the fact that only adventitious rooting species are used. So those are those species that are capable of producing roots from a part of the plant that is not root tissue. And those are riparian species that are adapted to the inundation and sediment deposition in the stressful flooding environment. So there's meristematic tissue that's present, and the stress stimulates a hormonal response. So it's a small group of species. We have 3 or 4 willows that we use, cottonwood, and then these bottom 3 species, as you'll see in some of our outcomes, have still decent but lower survival than other species, than the willows in particular. Okay, so I wanted to show you an example of where we use this technique. This is a site outside of Ellensburg on a private landowner's property who was very interested in getting some support on the rapid bank erosion occurring. And he also had cattle on this property. We also wanted to put some roughness into the riparian zone to slow surface flows, which are pretty frequent in frequent flooding in this area, and help to slow those velocities, drop out sediment, and capture fecal coliform before it hits the side channel. So this is a typical precipitation zone for us, about 9 to 12 inches. That's the dominant zone in all of our counties. But as you saw, we stretch from the interior Columbia Basin to the top of the Cascades. This was a low terrace with moderate groundwater and very well-drained soils. Pretty moderate weed competition, except for a low-lying portion of meander bend that has reed canary grass. So I'll show you that in a moment. And in addition to the cattle present, there are migratory elk. We started by treating the reed canary grass, which was treated with a broadleaf herbicide and brush cut. With the approach to reed canary grass is to suppress it during plant establishment. And in some situations, we've moved to not even suppressing it and just planting plant material that is tall enough to exceed the top of the reed canary. So we suppress it. We suppressed it in the area that was necessary. There was a lot of pasture grass that we just mowed and didn't do anything else. And then we used a deep planting technique of the hydraulic ram, using those adventitious rooting species because there was no irrigation available on this site. We also used a variable density planting. So in the gold area, which is about a 30-foot buffer, we planted at extremely high density, about 5 to 7 foot spacings to jumpstart that heavy rooting density and slow down erosion. And then away from that, we planted our more standard 10 to 12 foot spacings. We also installed a 7-foot tall electrified cattle and elk fence, which was a design that was desired by the landowner, and it seems to be working very well. So what we found at this site after the first year, this was planted relatively recently, after 1 year, we had over 73% survival, which is pretty typical for our projects, really being a lot of variability among species. Highest survival representing the greatest bulk of our species were willow species. Sadly, cottonwood was one of our target overstory canopy species, and even in the first year, only less than 70% survival. The other real low survival is our Ulmus incana, or mountain alder, which is our dominant alder in our 9 to 12 inch precip zone. Although above 60%, and as you'll see at the end, still within the threshold of what we define as success in our very harsh conditions of the east side. So I wanted to jump now to conventional planting, which is, I think, what most of us think of in our mind's eye when we think of riparian restoration, which is either by hand, like the volunteers assisting our restoration technician crew here, or assisted by augering holes using a skid-steer mounted auger. And we can use any variety of plant assemblages with this planting technique, as I'm sure most of you know. However, irrigation is required at almost all of our sites when groundwater exceeds 2 or 3 foot depth. And again, that's groundwater at during the low flow period of the year. This is an example of a site, and I'm just showing, I'm not going to talk about the details of the site, but a site that had a low terrace where we were able to do conventional planting and a high elevation, or a moderate elevation terrace, excuse me, that was 3 to 4 feet above summer flows, and that where we did irrigate for a couple of years. So why would we irrigate? You may not have these challenges over on the west side, or maybe you do in some rain shadow zones. But we're in, as I said, most of our planting areas are in the 6 to 20 inch precip zone. And when groundwater exceeds 2 to 3 feet, we have seen projects do exceedingly poorly with less than 30% survival without irrigation. We know that we're speeding root development when we irrigate, and that's really what we want. We want to help those plants be as effective as possible at extracting moisture from the soil in our droughty growing seasons on the east side. So overall, really increasing plant survival and helping us to meet our goals. The way that we do this is by planning for irrigation for 1 to 2 seasons with deep, infrequent watering. And by that, I mean delivering about 5 gallons per plant once every 1 to 2 weeks. Largely, we only use drip irrigation, unless there are a couple of sites where there are some other logistical issues. This does require a water source being present on the site and a water right to that water. So definite logistical issues, and that is one of the key reasons that we pivot from conventional planting to deep planting when we do not have access to water. There are different irrigation techniques that that can be used. As you saw, we use largely the drip irrigation because of not only is it more effective, but it does not have this high labor cost associated with it, which handheld irrigation deployment, handheld hose deployment, or broadcast does, and indirectly via broadcast because of the heavy weed growth that's associated. Okay, I'm going to run very quickly through a site that is in the Cle Elum area that has very deep groundwater, well-drained soils, elk, deer, and moderate weed pressure. So this was a conventional planting that did have irrigation and irrigation rates associated with it. And we selected transitional shrubs and conifers because of the deep groundwater that was 6 to 8 feet at summer flow. So established the drip irrigation the first season after planting, and we also installed a temporary elk fence, which has now been removed in year 4. And this is the last season that we'll be doing weed management at the site. So what we saw here is initially really high performance of plants, almost 90% survival across the site, that dropped to about 70% survival. And then after irrigation was removed, still stayed fairly stable. So really expected a deeper drop in survival after irrigation was pulled. Okay, I'm going to take a couple of minutes to help us look at kind of broad brush across what results that we're seeing on several sites, with the caveat that was provided in the morning, the earlier monitoring project, which is that sites are very different, really hard to draw conclusions across multiple sites when there's very different conditions and also different methods being used. But some of the things that we can say is that using conventional planting, and this is data that you just saw, this is the site that I just showed you, even with variations in groundwater, what we're seeing is a drop off of 5 to 10% from year 1 to year 2. And many of our projects are hovering around that 70% survival, which again is the threshold. This is an unusual site, and there are some areas that had on the far right, that had very high groundwater elevations that may have influenced that extraordinarily high early survival, and that's still going on today. So we still haven't seen these two sites where irrigation is removed, but we are anticipating that there will be some mortality following pulling the irrigation. We pulled the irrigation, but we don't have those results yet. We also plant live stakes, but extremely rarely. The only time we do that is when we're planting into groundwater, into wetland conditions in our project areas. In year 1 at these two sites, we saw reasonable survival, although those do drop off again. So just trying to give you a flavor of what we're seeing over here for what you see on your sites. We did monitor a site where the hydraulic ram was used to plant live stakes, and that had not excellent survival in the first year, and by year 3 we're at 35% survival. So that's a technique that we do not use regularly. In terms of the deep planting, I'm showing you 3 different sites that were planted with the hydraulic ram in year 1 and 2 data in this set of graphs on the left, and an augering site on the right. And again, very different sites, different soils, different depths to groundwater. But again, the takeaway here is that 50 to 60% survival by year 2 seems to be pretty typical for this method. And we're working on ways. We actually implemented a project this fall to look at different ways we're testing different methods within one single large site to increase survival. And again, in auguring, different site, different conditions, but still by year 2 hovering in the 70 to 80% range at this very successful site. And I just wanted to wrap up by going back to our restoration timeline and remind us all that when we're talking about riparian restoration, we often think of this planting that happens for us in year 2, but there's a whole lot of planning and preparation work, field work as well, that goes on before we stick one piece of plant material in the ground, and then 2 to 3 years of work that occurs following planting. So with that, and all with the goal to increase our survival and attain those riparian function goals. So with that, I'd like to thank you for your attention. Again, thank you for your invitation, and I'd be happy to answer any questions if there are any, or if there's time.
And is beaver restoration done in coordination with Yakama riparian plantings to raise the water table to be able to plant more mesic species?
Yes, we do. Well, I should say that one of my colleagues is involved in the region in beaver dam analog restoration projects to raise the water table. And he is working, we don't have an active beaver restoration program, but he's working with partners to get that started again. The Yakama Nation and WDFW at one time had a very active relocation program.
Have you dug up some of the deep planted stock to understand root growth at various depths?
No, but we have been talking about that in the planting trial that we did down on the lower Yakama River this year, because we are trying to tease out why we have lower survival when we know that that material is in the root. The rooted plants are placed in moist soil. So it may have to do with air pockets along the stem. And so we're very interested to see if that's what's going on. But yeah, great idea. We're trying to figure out how to do that, but getting out to a restoration site and digging a 5 feet deep hole is very tricky at best.
Do you have issues with damage to or failure of irrigation infrastructure from wildlife, humans, deterioration? And how would you minimize this issue, if so?
Yeah, that's a great question. And we have, just for example, the last site that I showed you is about 9 acres on 3,000 stream feet, and we had 1 to 2 staff go out when we were watering once every 2 weeks. So they would spend a day, and as irrigation was running, they would walk through the site and check every emitter, check the pressure, and while they were also doing weeding. So it does require, it is not effortless, is I suppose what I want to say, to use drip irrigation. But if you've ever tried to water 4,400 plants with a tank and hoses, there's no comparison. You know, by the time you watered them all, you'd be starting your watering program all over again. So it's just not effective. So what we use screens to manage plugs and check emitter valves. We do have, there is rodent damage, and that's repaired at the time of irrigation every 2 weeks.
Is there a significant implementation cost difference between augering and RAM installation?
And the hydraulic ram, not significantly, no. But they do have, they can't be used in the same soils. So augering is better in fine soils that are more cohesive. The hydraulic ram may work better in soils that are less cohesive, more well drained, in sands, gravels, and cobbles that collapse. That's all I can say about that. I don't have any real comparison data on that.
With deep planting, what method of hole excavation works best on very cobbly sites? Yeah, so you're just,
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, we've tried using, early on when we started using this method, we were playing around with the auger, and we ended up, I mean, you can also dig trenches. We had an auger and an excavator on site and no access to a hydraulic ram. And we ended up using a 1-foot excavator bucket to dig 8-foot long trenches that were perpendicular or kind of angled perpendicular to the stream. And then we created these high density clusters in order to get down to groundwater. So because it was so cobbly that the holes were collapsing, we couldn't, after we'd auger a hole and it would end up being 2 feet deep.
And have you explored reusing irrigation lines? And have you developed any strategies for rapid deployment and recovery of irrigation materials?
Yeah, that is super. We're actually in our 2nd season of pulling the line. So we're still figuring out what we can reuse, but right now we have a whole lot of material that we have stored. We pulled from sites that it's been removed from in the last couple of seasons. And our staff that are managing those irrigation deployment projects are pretty comfortable with the ability to reuse a lot of the material.
Can you talk more about the need for a water right to utilize available water for irrigation? That is, if you're staying under 5,000 gallons use in a day, do you still guarantee you have a water right, or are your plantings always more than 1,000 plants at a site?
Our plantings are, I'm trying to think about, so I'm not sure that I am following the question. If there is a need, we've been advised that if we don't have a water right, that we need to secure a water right, even if it's a very low volume use. And I don't know the specifics on the differences between our conditions or where the questioner is coming from. And I'm not an expert on water rights. What I can tell the audience is that the Eastern Washington Riparian Symposium is doing a 3-hour remote workshop on March 25th, and there'll be a couple of presentations on water use and water rights. So there will be somebody from the Department of Ecology talking about securing temporary water rights for riparian restoration irrigation.